My husband's favorite hobby is making me the punchline of every joke, but this New Year's Eve, his big mouth finally cost him everything. It starts with a humiliating adoption joke at my parents' formal dinner that stops the room cold, escalates into a violent confrontation when my father realizes my husband found a secret medical file he was never supposed to see, and ends with a New Year's Day divorce filing and a DNA test that changes my entire identity. If you think a joke is just a joke, wait until you see the secret this one uncovered. My name is Elena, and I have been married to Mark for 6 years. But if I am being honest, the last 3 have felt more like a slow-motion car crash because Mark has developed what he calls a dry wit, but what everyone else calls a pathological need to humiliate me in public to boost his own ego. He's the kind of man who waits for a room to go silent so he can drop a joke about my weight or my career or my cooking, and then looks at me like I'm the crazy one when I don't laugh. But this New Year's Eve, he crossed a line that turned our holiday into a forensic autopsy of our marriage. We were at my parents' annual gala, which is a very formal black tie event attended by their wealthy social circle, and my father, who is a prominent neurosurgeon, was giving a speech about the importance of family and legacy as we prepared to ring in the new year. As my father was talking about how I inherited his analytical mind, Mark let out a loud snort and stood up with his champagne glass in hand, looking already half drunk and completely entitled. He interrupted my father and said, "Analytical mind? Are we sure about that, Doc? Because looking at Elena compared to the rest of you, I've always said she looks more like the milkman's accidental gift than a doctor's daughter." The room went deathly silent, and I felt the blood drain from my face as Mark laughed at his own joke and leaned over to me, whispering loudly enough for the whole table to hear, "Come on, Elena, everyone knows you were probably a clearance rack adoption from the local hospital. Look at your hair compared to your sister's." I waited for the usual uncomfortable chuckles, but they never came because the reaction from my parents was unlike anything I had ever seen. My mother's face went a ghostly shade of white, and she actually dropped her wine glass, which shattered against the marble floor, while my father's expression shifted from confusion to a level of primal rage that I didn't think he was capable of. Mark was still smirking, thinking he had just delivered a killer comedic set, but he didn't notice my father walking toward him until it was too late. My father didn't argue, and he didn't tell Mark to apologize. He simply grabbed Mark by the shoulder with a grip that made Mark's smirk vanish instantly and told him in a voice that was barely a whisper but sounded like a thunderclap, "You will leave this house right now, and if you ever speak that word in this home again, I will personally ensure you never speak again." Mark started stammering that it was just a joke and that everyone was being so sensitive, but my father didn't let go. He literally dragged Mark toward the foyer while my sisters and I sat there in a state of total psychological shock. I didn't understand why a stupid, insensitive joke about adoption, something Mark had joked about dozens of times before in private, had triggered such a violent and absolute response from my parents. But as I looked at my mother, who was now hyperventilating into a napkin, I realized that the joke hadn't just been an insult. It had been a direct hit on a secret that had been buried for 30 years. Mark was thrown out into the cold New Year's Eve night without his coat, and my father slammed the door so hard the glass rattled in the frames before he turned back to the room and told everyone the party was over. As the guests scurried out in a panic, I stood up and looked at my parents and asked the question that would change my life forever. "Why did you react like that unless it's true?" The silence that followed wasn't the silence of a party ending. It was the silence of a family collapsing under the weight of a 30-year-old lie, and I realized then that my husband hadn't just made a joke, he had accidentally revealed the forensic truth of my existence. The next 4 hours were a blur of tears and legal documents as my parents finally sat me down in my father's study and confessed that Mark's joke wasn't a lucky guess. He had actually found my biological adoption papers in a locked safe in our basement months ago and had been using that information to joke about my identity as a way to psychologically destabilize me without me knowing why it hurt so much. My father explained that they had never intended to tell me because the circumstances of my birth were complicated, and they wanted to protect me from the truth of who my biological parents were. But Mark had been sitting on this information like a predatory animal, waiting for the most public moment to weaponize it. The level of sociopathic calculation required for my husband to know I was adopted and then spend months making jokes about me not fitting in while watching me struggle with my self-esteem was a level of evil I couldn't even process. My father told me that he had suspected Mark was digging for information after Mark asked several suspicious questions about my blood type and medical history during Thanksgiving, but he never imagined Mark would be cruel enough to air it out at a New Year's toast. I felt a cold rage start to replace the shock, because I realized that my marriage wasn't just toxic, it was a long-term psychological experiment conducted by a man who hated me enough to turn my own origin story into a punchline. I called Mark's phone, and he actually had the nerve to answer and tell me that I should bring him his coat because it was cold outside, and that my father was overreacting to a bit of banter. I told him then that I knew he had seen the papers and that he was a disgusting coward for using my life as a joke, and his voice immediately shifted from smug to cold as he told me, "Well, Elena, at least now you know why I never really respected you. You're just a stray they picked up to feel better about themselves." I hung up the phone and looked at my father, who was already calling his lawyer to start the process of an emergency annulment and a restraining order, because if Mark was willing to do this at a public party, there was no telling what he would do once he realized he had lost his meal ticket. My parents showed me the original documents, the forensic proof that I was born in a small town 3 states away to a woman who couldn't keep me, and they spent the rest of the night apologizing for the lie, but I told them that the lie wasn't the problem. The problem was the man I had allowed into our lives who had used that lie to torture me. We spent the transition into the new year, not with champagne and fireworks, but with a shredder and a legal pad as we began to systematically remove Mark from every part of our lives, including the bank accounts he had been draining and the car he had been driving that was in my father's name. The joke had been the catalyst for a total life audit, and as the clock struck midnight, I realized that for the first time in my life I wasn't living a lie anymore, and I was finally free of a man who viewed my pain as his personal entertainment. By New Year's Day, the locks on our apartment had been changed, and all of Mark's belongings were sitting in trash bags on the curb, while a private security detail hired by my father stood watch to ensure he didn't try to force his way back in. Mark showed up at noon looking disheveled and frantic because he had realized that his joke had cost him access to the lifestyle he had become accustomed to, and he started screaming through the door that I was nothing without him, and that my parents were kidnapping me. I walked out onto the balcony and looked down at him, and I didn't feel sadness or anger. I just felt a profound sense of disgust for the man who thought he could bully his way through life, using other people's secrets as leverage. I told him that I had already filed for divorce, and that my father's legal team was currently reviewing the evidence of his financial grooming, and that he had 10 minutes to take his trash bags and leave before the police were called to arrest him for trespassing. He tried one last time to play the victim, saying that I was abandoning him over a simple misunderstanding, but I reminded him that a joke is supposed to be funny, and the only thing funny about this situation was how quickly he had destroyed his own future for the sake of a cheap laugh. He finally realized that the golden goose was gone, and he slunk away into the gray afternoon while I went back inside to start the long process of discovering who I really was outside of the lies and the abuse. My parents and I are in a much better place now because the secret is finally out in the open, and we don't have to pretend anymore, and I've even started the process of finding my biological mother with my father's full support. Mark tried to sue for a spousal support settlement, but when the judge heard the recording of his New Year's Eve toast and saw the evidence of his psychological abuse, he was laughed out of the courtroom and left with exactly what he brought into the marriage, which was nothing. This New Year's Eve didn't go the way I planned, but it was the most important night of my life because it taught me that the truth is always better than a comfortable lie, and that family isn't about DNA. It's about who stands by you when the jokes stop being funny. I am starting this year as a single woman with a new sense of identity and a very short tolerance for anyone who thinks they can make me the punchline ever again. So, what do you think? Was my husband's adoption joke enough of a reason to end a 6-year marriage and have him kicked out by my parents? Or should I have tried to work through it for the sake of the holiday? Let me know in the comments below. Hit that like button if you think Mark got exactly what he deserved for being a holiday bully. And don't forget to subscribe for more daily Reddit tales of secrets and justice. See you in the next one.